Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us, both all the National Association of Regional Councils, as well as the National Association of Development Organization members, and we're happy to have N4A here with us as well. We're going to give folks just a couple minutes before we get started, so please stand by. All right, for those who are joining us, good afternoon. Thanks for joining our OAA Reauthorization Advocacy webinar. To kick it off, we are going to have Joe McKinney, Executive Director from the National Association of Development Organizations, give us a few introductory remarks before we get into the content of the webinar. So now I'd like to turn it over to Joe.
Well, thank you, and good afternoon, everyone, and appreciate you taking time to join us today. I am Joe McKinney. I'm the Executive Director of the National Association of Development Organization, and we're delighted today to co-host this webinar on the Older Americans Act in partnership with the National Association of Regional Councils and the National Association of Area Agencies on Aging. As some of you may know, this is the second webinar in a two-part series. Our first webinar that we held earlier focused primarily on an overview of the Older Americans Act and its history, and today our focus is going to be on the reauthorization and advocacy. I want to begin by thanking NARC and N4A for their ongoing partnerships. As you know, we share many common priorities, and we're incredibly glad to be able to partner with NARC to bring you today's webinar and also to engage in joint advocacy efforts, both in support of the Older Americans Act reauthorization and in support of the many other shared goals that we have. As you may know, both organizations have been working closely with Autumn Campbell at N4A, who has been leading the effort on reauthorization of the Older Americans Act, and she's been really fantastic, a great partner for both organizations, and we appreciate her guidance and leadership to NADO and to NARC, and we're very grateful for her leadership. So today we want to provide all of you with the latest information that we have on the status of the Older Americans Act, the important authorization legislation that ensures that older Americans receive vital services that help with them age with independence and also provide support to their caregivers. We know that regional development organizations like NARC and NADO members play an essential role in providing services to the senior citizens, both as designated area agencies on aging and also in tandem with your efforts to provide other support services in your region. We're thrilled today to have Autumn Campbell with us, who's going to talk us through the legislation, its current status, and ways that you can help educate your elected officials on the value of the Older Americans Act. So with that, Autumn, I'll turn it over to you. Autumn is the Senior Director of Public Policy and Advocacy at N4A. So welcome, Autumn.
Great. Thank you so much, Joe. I'm doing two parts here today, and so appreciate joining NARC and NADO members on this webinar, but also please feel free to ask questions later on and always reach out to us separately as well, as N4A can help support your advocacy efforts and answer your questions on Older Americans Act reauthorization and other aging policy issues. So the first topic I will tackle today is a status update on where we're at now with the Older Americans Act reauthorization. Despite a few other things that are happening in DC right now, we're happy to report that one positive development is that Older Americans Act has gained some additional traction. We started the year on a very busy foot around Older Americans Act reauthorization in the Senate and in the House, and then each chamber has kind of retreated to their respective corners over the summer, developed and put some meat on the policy bones of the reauthorization, and we've got some exciting updates to share in terms of progress that the House has made, and also some ongoing discussions in the Senate on achieving a bipartisan reauthorization, hopefully in the very near future. So right now, the Senate still remains, and this is consistent with what the update that I gave on the last webinar, the Senate still remains kind of stalled out on their draft bill. There's not an official bill that was introduced on the Senate side, so I can't give you a bill number. and they are stalled out there on negotiations over the funding formula in the Act, which is not a political negotiation as much as it is a geographic negotiation. So I think that despite the lack of public progress on that issue, there is continuing to be progress among the key offices involved in that discussion around the funding formula. It's also an issue that N4A and many other organizations don't weigh in on because we have members across the country and in every state and region. So we don't want to be pitting one member against the other in terms of how funding is allocated through the Act. So we hope that we will hear some news in the near future. It might not be by September 30th from the Senate that there's been an agreement reached on that funding formula. However, in the House, we have been working very, very closely with House Education and Labor Committee staff over the last several months to put together their Older Americans Act reauthorization bill that they introduced, that they dropped last Monday on September 16th. That bill is the Dignity in Aging Act, or HR 4334. It is co-sponsored by Chairwoman, Education and Labor Subcommittee Chairwoman Suzanne Bonamici from Oregon, Subcommittee Ranking Member Congressman Comer from Kentucky, and then other Democratic and Republican members of the Education and Labor Committee, including Representative Elise Stefanik from New York, Susie Lee from Nevada, Susan Wild from Pennsylvania, and Dusty Johnson from South Dakota. So there is a pretty broad representation of both party affiliation and geographic stake in Older Americans Act reauthorizations. We were really thrilled to see that this was such a bipartisan effort coming out of the House Education and Labor Committee, and that bill was actually unanimously approved out of committee last Wednesday, the 18th. So go ahead, next slide. I'm going to go over quickly some of the details of each of the bills. The Senate details I will go over rather quickly because they are the same as what I gave, the update that I gave to you during the last webinar if you were there. But again, feel free to ask questions. Overall, the word to describe the Senate draft bill for Older Americans Act reauthorization is modest. The Older Americans Act has a 64-year history and has been a 54-year history and has been reauthorized over a dozen times in those over 5 decades since the bill was first enacted into law. Most of those reauthorizations have been relatively modest, and this Senate draft bill would continue that pattern of reauthorization. The reason being, for the most part, is that political realities of the day are what they are, and there's not a lot of big, bold ideas that are coming out, especially of the Senate at this point. But we are also very adamant that the Older Americans Act, because of its commitment to local flexibility and because of the person-centered and community-centered nature of the Act, it works pretty well right now. So there aren't a lot of changes other than significant additional funding that the Act really needs to work well. So N4A tends to err on the side of moderation when we are talking ideas for reauthorization. That said, the Senate draft bill was bipartisan. There are a number of reports for the Administration on Aging and also including the Government Accountability Office to do. So instead of taking big, bold measures on any particular issue area, the Senate draft bill focuses on reporting about how things are working currently. The Senate draft bill also didn't deal with some of the more contentious issues of the Act, the funding formula being one of them, which they're still working on right now. It also did not deal with the Senior Workforce Development Program under Title V of the Older Americans Act, or CSEP, as you may know it, and then also didn't deal with Title VI, the Native American Aging Programs. So next slide. What was in the Senate bill were a few of N4A's priorities, and again, some modest updates to the current Act. The Senate draft bill does take a specific focus on caregiving, particularly on caregiver assessment, to ensure that when caregivers approach aging network entities, that they are accurately assessed and evaluated for the needs the services and the needs that they have. There's also a report on, one of the reports, a report on social isolation. This is an issue that has been emerging over the past few years, and members in both the House and the Senate are looking for opportunities to do more around the negative health consequences that can occur from social isolation and loneliness. The Senate draft bill also aims to better support particularly older caregivers who are raising most often their grandchildren or great-grandchildren, and this has been somewhat of a significant issue in various areas of the country that are particularly hard hit by the opioid epidemic. So what the Senate draft bill does is eliminate the cap under the Older Americans Act National Family Caregiver Support Program for grandparents raising grandchildren. Just completely eliminates the current 10% cap on that funding, so that funding can go to caregivers who need that support. The Senate bill does do a little bit to alleviate some administrative burden in the nutrition programs, particularly between the congregate and home delivered meals nutrition programs, and encourages states to be flexible to ensure that funding between those two programs is flowing where the needs are for particular communities. And again, there's a study assessing unmet needs in nutrition programs, and N4A is pushing to expand that study so that that it looks at the unmet needs of all Older Americans Act programs, not just the nutrition programs. Next slide. The Senate bill attempts some moderation on area agencies on aging who are looking to engage in integrated care and other business opportunities with Medicaid, increasingly Medicare, and other healthcare payers. It does give a nod to, although it doesn't have a lot of teeth behind, adding some additional support to Title IV, which is the research, demonstration, and evaluation section of the Older Americans Act. And again, there's some additional studies on looking at the issue of home modifications, particularly in rural areas, recognizing that often in order for people to stay in their homes, those homes need to be retrofitted and updated and adapted to allow them to age in place. And I'm, again, happy to answer additional questions on these particular issues, but like I said, overall, the theme for the Senate draft bill on Older Americans Act reauthorization is modest. Next slide. Okay, so where are we in the House? Well, it's still a modest bill. That certainly hasn't changed, but given, again, the political dynamics at play in the House, as well as some leeway that members in the House have to kind of deal with, particularly the issues of the funding formula, they're not quite as bogged down on some of those issues as the Senate is. So they have a little bit more just political capital to work with in crafting the Older Americans Act reauthorization bill. The House also took a different approach than the Senate. Committee staff spent a very long time on the front end, engaging with stakeholders, assessing policy proposals, kind of running the proverbial traps on various areas of the bill, and they obviously delayed announcing or introducing any particular bill until they had a pretty solid piece of legislation that didn't have a lot of surprises for kind of key stakeholders and members who have been who've been really paying attention to this process. So what we saw last week come out of the House Education and Labor Committee in HR 4334 is a bill that addresses a few important areas, and I've indicated here both where N4A's priorities, and I know our priorities hopefully align quite nicely with NADO and NARC, are addressed, and then that kind of green symbol that you see on the side there also indicates areas where there is alignment between the two chambers. So while the language may not be completely the same between the House and the Senate bills, or one may go farther than the other, they're at least speaking to some of the same issues in their two respective bills, and so that bodes well for conferencing on some of these issues, particularly where they are priority issues. So first and foremost, I think this is probably the most exciting thing that we saw come out of the House bill is that the authorization recommends significantly increased funding for Older Americans Act programs really across the board. And I say significant, it's significant again given the current political climate. The authorization is a 5-year reauthorization, which we were pleased to see introduced in the House. And it would increase authorization levels. Now, that doesn't guarantee funding. That's done through the appropriations process, but the authorization certainly doesn't hurt. It would increase those authorization levels by 7% over current funding in the first year of the authorization, and then by 6% every year thereafter for the period of 5 years. So we were really pleased to see that increase. I have not done the math yet on what that overall increase looks like, but it's more than we've seen in any number of previous reauthorizations. So we were really happy to see the bipartisan effort in the House on increasing those authorization levels. One other area that the House bill addresses that's really important to N4A and also has some implications, particularly for area agencies on aging that are housed within a local or regional government, is that the Act includes language that really clarifies what area agencies on aging can do in the way that they may engage with private pay or integrated care. Currently, nothing in the law says that AAAs can't do those activities, but we were really pushing to add some extra language to make it very specific that area agencies on aging could, in fact, partner outside of their Older Americans Act dollars, could, in fact, partner with other healthcare payers and entities. And also, a priority under this specific issue area was ensuring that the Administration on Aging had the authority to invest in building that business acumen, so to speak, for aging network entities to engage in some of those other business opportunities with other healthcare payers, again, outside of the Older Americans Act. Next slide. The House bill also mirrors the Senate bill in terms of its emphasis on family caregivers, which we were certainly pleased to see. The House bill includes the same recommendation that the Senate bill did to eliminate that Title IIIe cap for support for grandparents raising grandchildren. And we were, again, thrilled to see that the House and the Senate were aligned there. The House bill also focuses on that issue of caregiver assessments and ensuring that caregivers receive the supports that they need for their particular situations. N4A worked very closely with both House and Senate staff as well as AARP to make sure that that language wasn't providing any sort of onerous burden on area agencies and other aging network entities, but that it was speaking to the importance of ensuring that caregivers are effectively evaluated for their needs. And then the House bill, we were really, really happy to see that the House bill also added a little bit more, again, more meat to the policy bones of the Title IV Research, Demonstration, and Evaluation section of the Older Americans Act, and provided for the first time an actual authorization for that funding at $20 million a year. That particular title has not been funded in nearly a decade at this point, and given the changes in the aging demographic and changes in healthcare and the need to ensure that we're meeting the needs of this aging population, research, demonstration, and evaluation is critically important to ensuring that the aging network and its stakeholders are actually being effective at the work that they're doing. So this, assuming appropriations, which is a big assumption, but that particular authorization is really important for that research, evaluation, and demonstration authority within the Act. Next slide. I'll go over this quickly. The House bill takes a look at Title VI, the Native American Aging Programs, which is an area that the Senate bill did not address at all. And again, N4A was very involved in this to ensure that our Title VI network of aging programs across the country had some additional investment that they need, not only to increase their own acumen in serving Indian elders, who are the most vulnerable population of older adults in the country, but also that there was some investment in the network, particularly the Title VI network, that has been drastically underfunded for decades, to ensure that Title VI programs could really start looking at how to provide some of the more supportive services under Title VI that are currently authorized, but often are not funded at levels adequate to allow Title VI programs to provide anything other than nutrition supports and caregiver support. So this proposal aims to create a demonstration authority to really focus on those other wraparound supportive services under Title VI. So that would be the home assistance, the home modification, adult day, bathing and dressing help, really all of those other wraparound, transportation is another one, services that are authorized under Title VI, but often aren't adequately funded for Native American elders. Next slide. And then there's a couple other areas, this is not an exhaustive list of what's in the Act, but some other new areas that we saw in the House bill really focus on increasing opportunities for multi-generational collaboration. This is one of those areas that we've seen a lot of good work and best practices done on local, kind of in local communities and on a local level, and what we're aiming to do through the Older Americans Act is provide a platform where some of those best practices can be expanded and scaled. Also, we're pleased to see there's a continued focus on age-friendly communities and building age-friendly communities. So there's some updates to the House bill as well as the Senate bill that increases the focus on building and incentivizing those age-friendly communities. And then in the House bill does in fact update the Senior Workforce Development Program, Title V. And one of the particular changes that it makes is it adds individuals who have been involved in the criminal justice system who are looking to re-enter the workforce as a targeted or priority population for those workforce development efforts under Title V. And those are some of the updates I have right now on the House bill. And with that, I will turn it over to Neil.
Thank you very much, Autumn. Excuse me, and thanks for that excellent presentation. I think you've really helped us get up to where we need to be on the legislation. Before I begin, I just want to issue this caveat. I am not an attorney. I'm going to be talking about what is legal for regional councils, councils of governments, development organizations to do lobbying-wise, but I'm not an attorney. And so even though my presentation is based on documentation from the American Bar Association, I just want to make that clear, and that when you have questions about the specific things you may wish to do, it's always a good idea to consult with your legal counsel. So I know that many of you are concerned about lobbying. That is, what is legal for an organization like yours to be doing around lobbying, especially at the federal level. So I want to make it clear that as a general rule, your regions, your members can lobby the Congress, can lobby the administration, can advocate on behalf of particular issues and particular pieces of legislation. However, there are, of course, some limitations. This wouldn't be something involving the federal government if there weren't limitations. There are some limitations that you really should be aware of. First of all, if you do lobbying, and I'll talk a little bit more about the differences between different forms of advocacy, including lobbying, but if you do actual lobbying, you can use only up to 20% of your overall spending without having to worry about your tax status. Of course, and this is another caveat, if you are organized as a governmental entity under state law, and we know that some regional councils, some development organizations are established that way, then you should review with your legal counsel the rules that govern lobbying and advocacy. I know for a fact in some states, employees of the state are not permitted to lobby, although they can be involved in advocacy, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But generally, as a rule, elected officials, your local elected officials, are exempt from prohibitions on lobbying. There's a general rule that elected officials do not have to follow or are not required to follow the rules governing lobbying that would apply to most other individuals. But again, as I said earlier, you should always consult your legal counsel to be sure that you are comfortable with anything that you're doing. Now, there are three types of advocacy activities that I wanted to talk about today that I think are relevant to what we'll be asking you to do shortly. The first is lobbying, which under federal law is very clearly and specifically defined. The second is education, and the third is responding to requests for information. Now, if, for example, you meet with your legislators and policymakers to speak about your area agency on aging or any other program that your regional council or development organization may run, you would not be lobbying as defined by the federal government. If you're talking generally and broadly about what you do without connection to specific pieces of legislation, you can talk about the issues that may confront you as you operate your program because of limitations or other issues within an existing law. But if you are not talking about legislation or proposed regulation, then this would be considered education. And education, it should be noted, is an unrestricted and unlimited activity that falls under the larger advocacy umbrella. Now, education of legislators and policymakers is clearly a very important activity, and it's one that you should be doing on a regular basis. You should be letting members of Congress know what you're doing and what the successes are of the programs you operate. If, in contrast, the purpose of your meeting is to push for or against a specific piece of legislation, that would count as lobbying and fall within the 20% expenditure limitation. So, for example, if you meet with your member of Congress, send a letter to your member of Congress, make a phone call to their office, do any of those sorts of things, and you discuss a specific piece of legislation, such as reauthorization of the Older Americans Act, and you urge them to do a specific thing to move it towards passage or move it towards defeat, that would be considered lobbying. And if you advocate for specific amendments to a piece of legislation, that too would be considered lobbying. Finally, though, and here's the little catch, it's not uncommon for legislators or policymakers to request that experts in certain fields comment on the impact of a legislative proposal. So the AOAs, the AAAs that are on this call, it may be the case that you get a request from your representative or representatives and your Senate or your senators for some information about what the impact of a particular aspect of legislation or the particular impact of an amendment might be on your program. Now, responses to these requests from a member of Congress or the Senate are considered to fall under education, even if you're asked to comment on specific legislation. So if you receive a request from your congressman or senator, please know that you don't have to consider that to be lobbying. It is education. You are legally allowed to respond to their requests without having to indicate that you've been lobbying. So here are some examples. In response to a call to action from NARC or NADO to contact your senators or representatives to speak broadly about your programs and the challenges you are facing, that's not lobbying because it's not about a specific piece of legislation. Rather, it is part of an effort to educate your senators and representatives. If, in contrast, if you contact your senator or representative to speak about a specific piece of legislation, such as the reauthorization of the Older Americans Act, and you ask them to vote one way or another, that would count as lobbying because you are asking them to take a specific action on a specific piece of legislation. And one more important point of distinction. If one of your senators or representatives contacts you to provide them with an assessment of a piece of legislation, amendment, or regulation, as I noted before, and you provide specific recommendations, that is not lobbying because the information was requested of you by a member of Congress or a senator. And it's a critical distinction that you need to keep in mind because, as I've noted before, it doesn't come under the 20% expenditure limitation. But this isn't the end of the story, and I just want to alert you to a couple of other things you should be cognizant of. There are state and municipal and federal lobbying disclosure laws that you should be aware of. Now, if you are a governmental entity or a unit of designated as a unit of general purpose government or a governmental entity, and you are allowed to lobby, the federal lobby disclosure rules do not apply to you. However, if you lobby as any other kind of entity, then you do have to report what you do to the federal and perhaps state and local governments. Now, this has no impact on how much money you spend. You can spend any amount that you wish. What it has an impact on, though, is that you are required to make a public disclosure what you are doing on behalf of a legislative or regulatory issue. That involves lobbying, only lobbying. In addition, I've noted this, if your COG is a governmental entity or you are a state or local employee, you may not be able to lobby based upon specific laws of your state, county, or municipality. And again, you should check with your legal counsel. With that, I'd like to turn this back to Autumn, who's going to talk about some of the desired outcomes that we have for the advocacy efforts that we're going to talk more about upcoming in this webinar. Autumn? Autumn, are you there?
Autumn, you might be on mute.
Sorry. That's the first time I've ever done that on a webinar, but you know, there's a first time for everything. So thank you. I am glad that I did not have to take on the legal issues. And like Neil said, make sure you consult your legal counsel before knowing for certain what your parameters are. But for those of you who are comfortable in this work and embraced advocacy and education and even to some extent lobbying, I'll go over just a few best practices and tips. This is not rocket science by any stretch, but I do think some of these reminders are important. And I will just say, I don't have a slide on this, but to start off this section, I want to say that, again, especially for those area agencies who are on the webinar, that according to Section 306A6B in the Older Americans Act, that specifically provides that the Area Agency on Aging will serve as the advocate and focal point for older individuals within the community in cooperation with agencies, organizations, and individuals participating in activities under the Act. They also have the charge of commenting upon all policies, programs, hearings, levies, and community actions which will affect older individuals. So this is a unique part of the Older Americans Act that specifically charges area agencies on aging with the role of advocating for older adults in their communities. And this section of the Act should supersede other state and local regulations. Again, there are nuances there, especially for local government employees or state government employees. But I want to make sure to emphasize that that charge is spelled out within the Older Americans Act. Okay, so next slide. So I think the key thing here, and again, this is not rocket science, but in advocacy is one, to have compelling facts. Know, and if you are approaching this issue from a regional perspective, you know, within the Development Association or the Regional Council, make sure that you are connecting with your area agency on aging, whether they're administered through that body or hopefully you have a partnership with them if they're not, to understand what the actual facts are that are at play in your communities. That said, real life stories are important too, and it would potentially, I'm sure the area agency locally has some stories that they can share with you, but it certainly makes sense to keep a collection of stories or situations that you can speak to when you're talking particularly to federal lawmakers about the importance of Older Americans Act programs. And in terms of effective advocacy, you know, weaving together those facts and bringing life to them by telling an individual story is really important. And I think the fourth point here that I will make is that in doing that, it is most critical. All of these these three are important, but it is most critical to connect the dots. So making sure that the facts that you have and the story that you're telling connect directly to the decisions or policies that you're talking about with your federal lawmakers. You can talk to them all day about how great the adult day program is in your community, but if they don't understand that program is funded through the Federal Older Americans Act, it's not going to do a whole lot of good in terms of defining that ask. Next slide. So I call this my Abilene Clark, if anyone knows who that is, from the movie The Help, my you is kind, you is smart, and you is important slide. Remembering that you and your stakeholders, your employees and your professionals in your organizations, you are the expert and your feedback is incredibly valuable, as well as the fact that while it may not seem like it, and I know, you know, hopefully talking to a familiar audience on this fact, but, you know, members of Congress, they work for us, they work for you, and their job is to represent what's going on in your communities. So making sure that you approach these conversations with that kind of confidence. And also, again, recognizing that particularly for area agencies on aging, you are charged as that advocate to speak truth to reality of what's going on in your communities and on the ground. Next slide. And this is just a few kind of key points here for any interaction with lawmakers, whether it's a Hill visit or an email or a site visit in your community. Make sure that your federal lawmakers know who you are and what you do, particularly, again, for the AAA. Know what your ask is of them, even if that ask is not a vote yes or no or support this particular piece of legislation, even if that ask is just, we want you to understand the importance of these programs, or we want you to know what a funding cut would mean for older adults in our community. And then third, know that make sure your lawmakers know that you will follow up, you or your staff, and whether that is to clarify something that you need to find an answer to, or to schedule a future visit, make sure to lay out that follow-up plan. Next slide. Some of those follow-up ideas, just quickly here. Certainly following up to say thank you, and that's something I think that Marielle will talk about as well in terms of next steps on advocacy around Older Americans Act. Too often Congress doesn't get recognized for the good things that they are doing, so it's really important to say thank you to your lawmakers and leaders when there is something positive that happens. Again, it's important to follow up and answer any questions that maybe you couldn't initially, and I'm preaching to the choir here when I say that you may not always have all the facts right on hand, and that making up answers to questions is actually a disservice, because finding out answers to questions that you may not have on site gives you an opportunity, a natural opportunity to follow up with lawmakers. Certainly explore opportunities to continue building that relationship with both lawmakers and their staff, and whether that includes a site visit or a visit in DC when you're in town. Continuing that conversation is really important, as well as making sure to keep them informed and involved in your community and engaged as a stakeholder in the work that you're doing. So, if you've gotten a new grant, or if there's a funding decision that's threatening a program, or other emerging issues locally, make sure that they know that, and that doesn't have to be a complicated outreach with a lot of extra steps. It can just be an FYI, or an in case you missed this, we want you to know that this is going on, and that will keep lawmakers and often more importantly their staff engaged in what's going on with your programs on the ground. Next slide. Okay, so in terms of Older Americans Act, I won't get into specific charges for NARC and NADO. I will leave that to your respective associations, but I do want to highlight that where we're focused right now within N4A and with our AAAs is making sure that our grassroots materials are online and available, and that people know about them, so that as you are engaged in advocacy and education, that you can lean on N4A and use our materials to help inform your own efforts. So with that, I will turn it over to Mariel.
Thank you, Autumn, and thank you for all of your expertise and leadership on this topic. We're so delighted to work with N4A and NARC collaboratively on this issue with a unified voice. This is Mariel Burgoyne. I'm the Director of Government Relations and Legislative Affairs at NADO. And I want to chime in now really just to make a call to action to NADO and NARC members. Autumn has just provided us with some incredibly helpful information, both about OAA reauthorization and its status, along with these tips for engaging with your members of Congress. And so we want to ask NADO and NARC members joining us today to really join us in actively participating and educating your elected officials about the importance of reauthorizing the Older Americans Act. We encourage all of you to take the time to reach out to your elected officials to educate them, to really just provide them with information about the services you provide, the work you're already doing, either in your capacity as a designated area agency on aging, if you do have a AAA designation, or even if not, you can still participate in this advocacy and education process as a regional organization providing other critical support services in your region. So I want to present NADO and NARC members with this charge and this call to action to please go forward and actively participate in education and advocacy to the extent that you are able to do so, especially if any of your elected representatives are members of either the House Education and Labor Committee or the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, known as the HELP Committee in the Senate. Then in those cases, it's particularly important to encourage those members to support OAA reauthorization and to ask them to help us keep this moving forward. And also to thank them, as Autumn just said, especially for this most recent action by the House Education and Labor Committee, with them advancing the Dignity in Aging Act, thanking them for the championing of this work that they've already done is also crucial. So please join us in doing that. And even if your elected officials do not serve on those committees of jurisdiction, it's still very important to ask for their support nonetheless to make sure they are paying attention, that they understand the breadth and the scope of the services you provide to aging Americans and to their caregivers in your region. So a few ways that you can engage if you have the willingness and the ability to do so. First, we have a 2-week recess coming up here fairly soon. the first 2 weeks of October, both the House and Senate are on recess, which of course means that your members of Congress are likely to be headed back to their home districts, to your regions. So that is a great time to reach out to invite them to come and see your work firsthand, or simply to request a meeting with your elected officials or their staff to take the time to make sure they know about the work you're doing, to provide support to aging Americans and their caregivers. But in-person meetings aren't the only way you can engage. You can, of course, also write letters or make phone calls to your elected officials, which can be quite effective as well. And in doing so, please let us know if NADO, NARC, or N4A can provide you with any support you need. If you're interested in engaging on this issue, we will help you identify whether any of your elected officials are on the relevant committees of jurisdiction. We can provide you with all the talking points and resources you need for letters or phone calls or meetings. So please let us know whatever we can be doing to be helpful and to support you. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Macy with NARC. And I just want to say thank you again to Macy and Neil, the whole NARC team, Jessica, as well, for being truly wonderful partners and colleagues, and for joining us in hosting this webinar today, along with Autumn and M4A for her thought leadership and expertise. We are very, very fortunate to have both NARC and M4A's partnership, and we truly appreciate it. So back to you, Macy.
Thank you so much, and thank you for that wonderful thank you wrap up. That was perfect. So if we do have some time for question and answer, so if you are interested in asking a question or providing some sort of comment, feel free to type in a question in the question box on your GoToWebinar control panel. But for now, we do have a few comments that I felt would probably be good to read out, especially for those who are in Texas specifically. We had somebody write in providing sort of the language from Texas law that says, you know, that AAAs that are housing COGS in Texas are formed under the state statutes and do have some strict prohibitions in regards of lobbying. The specific language says an employee of a commission when using state appropriated funds, including federal funds, is subject to the same rules regarding lobbying and other advocacy activities as an employee of any state agency. And this person, I thought, could be some sort of best practice that could be worked around this is advising to utilize an elected official to avoid any perceived violations. So, you know, working with your elected officials, making sure that you're arming them with information that's relevant to your members of Congress, passing along any sort of stories that you have from your AAA if you cannot or don't feel comfortable enough to do direct lobbying yourself. But, you know, feel free to, I know Neil took a lot of time to draw up the differences between educating and lobbying, so feel free to educate away, but just know that, you know, lobbying from your elected official could be an option as well. I don't know if anybody else, any of the other speakers have any sort of comments or feedback on that.
Yeah, Macy, this is Autumn. I'll just quickly say that, again, under statute, area agencies on aging are required to have an advisory council as well. So that advisory council can often be leaned on to do some of the advocacy work that maybe specific employees would be prohibited from doing. And then speaking for the Area Agency on Aging Network, we are a network full of enthusiastic advocates who sometimes even take time out of their own personal time to send messages. So understanding and respecting restrictions and prohibitions that may exist in state law, often a little creativity can come into play to ensure that messages are still getting to key decision makers.
Great, thank you for talking on that. I appreciate it. So while we're waiting for maybe any last questions that come in, just so folks know, the PowerPoint slide is available to download on your GoToWebinar control panel. I believe it's available through Handouts. Otherwise, you'll be receiving an email from us sometime tomorrow, probably about 3 or 4 o'clock Eastern Time, with a link to the full webinar recording and a link to the PowerPoint slides, just in case you didn't get a chance to download them in this last few minutes of the webinar. But I don't see any other questions or any further comments, so maybe I'll just pass it over to Neil Baumberg to wrap things up.
Thank you, Macy. Just a couple of notes. First of all, I want to thank NADO, Joe McKinney and Marielle Burgoyne, and N4A, Autumn Campbell, for joining us on this webinar and for their outstanding contributions. I'd also like to thank Macy Morin and Jess Rootson of the NARC staff for helping to organize this webinar and make it happen. We're delighted to be working with N4A and NATO on this important issue, and we look forward to partnering with them on other important issues as we move forward. I just want to point out that on this last slide, you'll see the names of contacts at the various organizations. Do not hesitate to reach out to any one of us. We are here to work with you, help you, and address any issues or concerns you might have. So please reach out to us. With that, I'd like to just say thank you to all of you for joining this webinar. And with that, I announce it to be done. So thanks again and have a great day.
Great. Thanks all.